Hello, welcome back to my video series about Alteryx. I'm going to continue to talk about macros and present a little bit lighter version of some of my other videos. Being a developer, I typically jump right into solving the problem, and most of my videos about macro has been what they do and how them to get the job done. For the questions some people have asked, especially non-developers or people with a limited development experience, a lot of business analysts, because this is actually who Alteryx is targeted to, and they've asked, well, how do we start this macro? I mean, what is a macro input? What is a control parameter? What do I have to be concerned about? How do I get things started, much less how do I finish them? And looking through some of the materials I've seen, they really haven't just focused on the what is and how to use macro input and control parameters in order to start your workflow, and which ones do you choose and what you expect them to do, and etc. So we're going to focus just on the starting of the macros and what they are going to do given the inputs and parameters. The actual macros themselves that I'll be using in this exercise are very limited. They're just simply there as a placeholder to do something inside of the macro, but nothing actually very intense, or that actually would possibly be what you would use a macro for. So to that light, what we're going to look at is a couple of things that all about the beginning, and one that's sort of about the beginning slash end. And that is, we're going to look at a macro that has input but no control parameters. We're going to look at a macro that has no input but control parameters. We're going to look at one that has both macro input and control parameters, so you sort of compare how the two of them work together. And then as a wrap up, we're going to talk about what happens if you pass multiple rows of data through the control parameter, which is one of the really extremely useful and powerful usages of macros. And when we do that, we have to be careful of the macro output. So we will talk about that as well. So let's get started, and we're going to start with a blank slate. And what we're going to do is talk about just simply what we're going to do with input. So as I develop this macro, I need to make sure it works. And so what I'm going to do is to build just a simple workflow. And we're going to start out with some data. And this data is simply going to be called price. And what we're going to do is calculate two things from this price. So let's give it a price of 123.45. What we want to do is to make sure as we bring that in that we set it to, rather than a double, which is the default, we're going to go ahead and put this as fixed decimal because it's a dollar amount. And all we're going to do is to go ahead and drop in a formula that calculates the, and we're going to do this with a cut and paste just so I don't go making errors today. And it's going to go ahead and calculate the cost amount and the profit amount from the sale amount. And as we see here, I actually called this sale amount the first time through. Makes it a little bit easier if I call this sale amount. And then if we put a select on the end of this, cleaning things up along the way, as you can see, since I changed the input, I need to change this select by forgetting the missing fields. Modify this back to a fixed decimal, 10.2, run this through, and you can see that what we have done here, in case you're wondering, what we've done in here as well is we've gone ahead and rounded that calculation. We said that 22% of that sale amount is the actual profit and 78% of it is the cost amount. What 22% could be considered the markup, And then we go ahead and calculate the profit from that. Here's a good example of the round, how you would use it. And ultimately what we get out of this is the sale amount, the cost amount, and then the profit amount, which is what we want to do. So how do we turn this into a macro? So first, we need to have input coming into this macro in order to calculate this fixed cost and profit. Again, what we're doing here from a macro standpoint is going ahead and just simply saying we have a standard calculation. We can pass any data stream into this macro. We have to define what values we need from this input so that basically the selects and the formulas all work no matter what the data source coming in is. So we need to identify in our edit data just what we need from an attribute standpoint to make this work. So we're going to go ahead and cut and paste out our text data that we had, and we can see everything else works. So if we run this macro by itself, it'll go ahead and take that sample data and pass it through. We can see that this macro now works with our input. So what this is the macro input. It is a placeholder for the stream of data that you'll be passing into it, where you have a column in that stream that is your sales amount. And from that, you're going to calculate your cost and profit, add that back to the stream on the way back out, and we will just quickly drop a macro output onto that as well. So that way it will pass through. Keep in mind that as you look at your widgets along the way, people always ask, what is this unknown? Well, what this means is that it is a placeholder that will take care of all of the data stream that's coming in and pass it through just the way it is. The only piece of data that it needs to see from the stub of data is the actual column or columns that you need to do your work with. All the other columns will just be passed through. So we will need to identify those when we use this macro. That being said, let's go ahead and create ourselves a workflow that uses this macro. Going back into, make sure we do all this the proper order, we want to go ahead and save this. I'm going to put it inside my macros in my tips area. And this is actually called calculate cost profit 1. So I will overwrite what I already have there. So now it has been saved so that I can easily utilize it in a workflow. So all I want my workflow to do is to have some data. As you can see here, I have three pieces of data. I have a product, a unit, the sales quantity, and the unit price. From that unit price, I want to determine what its cost and profit are by going into the macro that does that calculation for me with no additional parameters, just simply the data stream coming in. Now there's a couple things we haven't done to this macro yet, but I want to show you the starting point. If you see here, one thing we have is that we have no pretty icon, and I'll show you how to do that after we go ahead and work on this. And don't forget, we want to put a browse on the end to see the data. So this data stream is going to flow into the macro and flow out of the macro. But what I must do is identify that I have a sales amount that is necessary to do the calculations. What field in my input flow is that? Well, it happens to be unit price. So if we run this through, you can see in the output I now have cost and profit, but also I now have sale amount as opposed to what I started with, which was the unit price. So I don't want to change its name as we process through this, so we need to do a couple of modifications to this macro. Let's go ahead and change the icon. The icon is found in my interface designer. If you don't have that stubbed out, it's up here. You can click this on and minimize it. I tend to keep it on my left all the time. I hit the properties, and now here's where I can change my icon. I have a number of icons that I use. In this case, I'll be using my question mark. I've done that. The second thing is I want to give this column back its original name. Well, it just so happens that Alteryx thought of that as well, and that is the action. So I will take an action and put that action above my select. And I can actually connect my input stream to that action. We do not want to do an update value. But what we want to do is update select with the reverse field map. Alteryx knew what the name of the attribute that came into our macro is. It knows what it replaced as far as the data stream in the macro, and therefore it cannot give it its name back again on the way out, since I no longer need that for any further calculations. I will now save this. If I come back to my workflow, it gives me a warning that this macro has changed. Do I want to update it? The answer is absolutely. So I've updated it. Now when I run it, my output now shows that my unit price coming in is now my unit price going out, and I have cost amount and profit amount as well. So the macro that we created is just simply input data. I want to take some action upon that data stream, in this case do a standard calculation, and pass that back through again. It's a very useful thing to do if there are specific types of calculations that you do over and over again that you want to get just right. You can create that formula once, put it in a macro, and then use it within your stream very simply and directly. So let's look at scenario 2. This is where we have no input going into our macro. We just have a control parameter. What we want to deal with here is that if we have no data in this flow, there's no reason to have the macro. It has to have a flow of data because that's what Alteryx is designed around. That being said, your macro can actually start your data flow. There are reasons why you would do this. Primarily, you might want to remove the complexity of having to continually add a table after table after table, and you might just want to head and use a macro for that purpose. One of the videos talks about how to do a data mart join within a macro, so it essentially becomes an Alteryx view and you don't have to worry about joining multiple tables together. But that is the subject of that video, not this video. But if I don't have input coming in through a macro input, then what I have to do is create input within the macro. In this case, we're just going to go ahead and drag our puppy table in. Very simple macro here. And we'll do macro output. So this macro will simply read this table and pass it out. Not much of an interface, but what happens if we want to tell this macro which of our tables we want to see? So we look in here, we see we have table type, we have directory, we have a lot of things that we have to do in order to open this table. Wouldn't it be nice if all we had to do is tell it the name of the table, and it would go ahead and automatically read that for you? So we can do that by adding a control parameter. So what we want to do here is give this control parameter name. And it simply is we want the process that invokes this macro to give us a table name. The action that we want to take from that, we connect the queues together, we connect the lightning bolts together. We want to do is update the value of the table which is embedded in here. We don't want to change the entire file name. We just simply want to change puppy table. To do that, we click on the replace a specific string. So they give us the name of a new table, and we'll write over the name of puppy table, and then we can go ahead and read that database table for us. If we run this without anything, it simply reads the puppy table. And as we learned before, what we want to do here is to go ahead and configure this to have our icon. We don't have to worry about changing any names because it's simply the table name is going, the data or the fields from the table that we specify will come out of it, and that's all that we want to do. Let's go ahead and save this. I already have this one, and I called it replace table for input. I'm going to replace it here. So what we do is create a workflow that allows us to use this. Again, this is a macro. We must have some data to pass into those parameters. In this case, we can very easily do a text input. Give it the name my column, my table, and a value of breed dim. So that's what we'll want to read. We come over here to my macros that I've added to my bar. Drag my macro into it. We must specify the table name. That is my table. We'll put a browse on the end of it because that will return us our data. We run this, and we can see that now rather than returning the default value for that macro, which was the puppy table, I now return the data from within the breed dimension. So we have that there. So again, if I don't have any input flowing into my macro, the macro is designed, or the reason you have that macro is so that it can get your data and pass it back to the calling workflow as a data stream. The second use case for a control parameter but no input is so that you can affect the data stream that's coming out of the macro without you having to do any work or understanding of what's going on. In that case, what we want to look at in here is that that's the wrong cut and paste. Let's paste the right thing in. There we go. So we have our puppy table. And what we want to do in here is to filter it so that we just see the beagles coming out of it. But we want to give the workflow that is using this macro to determine which of the breed it wants to process. And you would do this possibly by calculating something like which breed had the most number of tricks performed in a time period, and that's what you want to see your puppy table only including, so you can do some processing for the award-winning puppies. But again, that's leaving it up to you trying a macro where what you have is a standard input. You have some type of calculation that will let you know which of the specific records you want coming out the other end. But again, this is just a very simple version of that. So what we want to do is affect this filter, and we can affect this filter again through a control parameter. So what we want to do here is to go ahead back to our interface. We want to have our macro output. That's the true side. And we want to have our control parameter. We're going to ask the user to enter a breed name. We want to take action from that control parameter. The user sends it to us, and that is in the filter over here. And what we want to do is update value. If we look through the constructs within the filter, these are all of the pieces of information that define how that filter works. And so we can modify with our control parameter any of these. In this case, we just want to change the name Beagle to what it is that's passed in. But again, you can see some other things you can work with. We see that's been changed. Go back into our interface designer, set our custom icon to the question mark, and save this workflow. Actually save this macro that is the workflow. I called this filter breed. So now we want to invoke this. So the simple thing is that we want to come in here with a breed. Oh, need to start something new. So that's where we need our text input. Call it filter breed to give it a different name for this field. And let's look at, let's see, we had done, let's look at poodle. Having set up that piece of data, we simply have a single record that has a value poodle into it. We come into our macros. This is our filter breed. Drop it in. The breed name is the filter breed field that we had defined, and add a browse onto the end of it. We run this, and now all that we have in here are poodles. Something else to look at, it'd be nice to know how well this worked. And we don't see any of the messages coming out of the macro. So we do that by going into our runtime of our workflow itself. And here it is, show all macro messages. So now when we run it, you can see that record number 1 coming out of our data stream goes into the macro and forced it to look at 212 trues and 1988 that were false. So we know that it indeed did filter that out. So again, this macro says that we have standard input. What we want to do is go ahead and allow the workflow that's developed to determine which breed needs to come out of the workflow once it's created, and it can do that through the macro. The next scenario has to do with where we have both macro input and a control parameter. The scenario there, we're going to start out with this one that you've seen here, which we used earlier. We're actually going to move things down so we have a little more room. So if you remember this, we were passing in a data stream. The macro was going to calculate the cost and profit of that data stream and return us 2 additional attributes, leaving the rest of the stream alone. But what happens if we also want to control how we calculate the cost and the profit? In other words, the 22 cents for markup was fixed into this. Maybe there's something else out there in the data warehouse that tells us what that cost markup is when we do our reporting. So we want to apply that standard value that comes out of a secondary source as opposed to being hard-coded in our macro. So this is where, let's go ahead and save this so we don't want to break the original one. I'm going to save this as, put it back in our tips, and it's going to be cost profit 2. So while this calculates the cost based on a fixed value, we want to be able to calculate and pass in that value from our work stream. And now we will combine the 2 different types of control that we have. So not only we have a data stream, but now we have a control parameter We're going to call this the markup rate. It will be coming into our process. What we want to do is take that value and change our calculation. We do that by dragging an action onto it, taking this into our calculate cost and profit formula, and now we want to edit this. So now we can go down and look at all of the pieces of information that can be modified by your macro and how this works. And in this case, we want to change this 22 cents or the 22% with the rate that's coming in. So we click on that expression, and we don't want to change it all. We just want to replace a specific string. In this case, we want to replace the 0.22 with what's coming in. If we run this as we had before, we see that we'll get the same data coming out the other side for the 22%, but we want to do is take a slightly different effect of this. So let's go ahead and remove out the old macro. Let's insert our new macro. We drop in number 2 here. Oops, let's go back. We actually did not save that. Now we've modified and saved. We come to our workflow 2. It tells us that it has changed. You notice now on this icon for the macro, there are 2 input streams that are required. One is the actual data coming in. In this case, we want to send a unit price into our sale amount, but we also have to have something coming in as the markup rate. So in our workflow, we would nominally go ahead and calculate or query or some other way get that data. In this case, we just simply want to give ourselves some text input. I'm going to call this my markup. And let's go ahead and make this 12.22. Sorry, 0.12. Again, not the best interface, not the best comment, but it's what we want to be able to show you as opposed to making something that's extremely functional and has dealt with all the issues that we might be. Now when we run it, I forgot to map it. Going back to questions, we want my markup. And we're going to go ahead and do one minor change to this as well once we show that it works. We now have our data, and we see that we now have a bit different cost than we did with the original execution. If you want to compare these side by side, we can go ahead and pull in our original macro, drop it over here, put a browse on the end of it. So this is the 22-cent version or 22% version. We have our unit price. Run them both through. So we see our profit in scenario number 1 is now 59 cents. And in this one, it is $1.09 because we had a bit more of a markup. In case you don't like the order that your questions are coming out, you can go back into your macro, into your interface designer. In this case, I'm going to pin it And you notice here my questions are in this order. We want to go ahead and move the markup rate to the top, sales amount to be in second place. We can unpin that, save it, come back to our workflow, which is here. It said it has changed. We click OK. You see that we don't have to change our names, but now they're in different order, with the markup rate being first and the sales amount being second, which sort of matches the order what's going on here. You notice the upside down question mark that denotes for the macro that we need to provide it a parameter. So now we've given a parameter that modifies how the calculation is done off of a standard input stream that has a sales price in it in order to get us the cost amount and the profit amount. So finally, what we want to talk about is the fact that going into your macro, even as a control parameter, this is a data flow. All of the examples we've used so far in this tutorial have been where there's been one record in that flow feeding into the parameter of your macro. If you have more than one record or row in your flow, then the macro will be executed once for each of those records. This is how macros become even more powerful. So if we add an additional row into our stream for our filtering of breed and call it bulldog, you'll see that we have two records flowing into our macro. So our macro will be executed twice. And our output represents that because the data has been stacked up and we have poodle and bulldog in our stream. If we look at the log, you see that record 1 resulted in 212 records being true, and record 2 resulted in 224 records being true, which then gives us our 436 records as output. This is how you can utilize macros to do more work than you would normally do within your stream in a much more direct format of the flow. So here, if we want to see more than one breed or set of breeds, we simply would calculate and create that stream to flow into our parameter set. And then the output represents all the records that match those different sets of filters. This gets a little bit more tricky, or trickier as the saying goes, when we look at the replace table for input. Here we're passing in a table name. In this case, we send it the breed dimension. It'll execute once for that control parameter and return us the data from the breed dimension. If we add a second table in here, and rather a second record for a second table, and we give it, for example, rather than breed dimension, we also give it the just drew a complete blank on what to give it. Well, let's go ahead and give it the puppy dimension. So now when we execute it, we see that we run into an error because the output needs to be homogeneous in that all the records have the same definition. Well, obviously these two tables have two different definitions, and so there it fails. Sometimes you do want to use this method for combining sets of data together and giving you one stream on the outside depending upon what the macro is doing. Such as if you're doing a multi-table read or you're doing a calculation based on fields, etc. The way that you get this to work is to go into your replace macro. In this case, we would replace table for input macro. We want to go back into the interface designer, and in the configuration we see that we have this output fields change based on the macro's configuration, which means that if the macro is being executed multiple times and the data flow is different each time, we need to compensate that. By default, this is turned off. We want to turn it on. In this case, that says that all of them have the same output, which we don't want to have. We can also configure by name or position, depending upon what our requirement is. The danger in this is that it will wait until all iterations are run before passing the data out. So it sort of puts a little block in your data flow as it waits for the macro to complete all of your executions, which will slow it down depending upon the amount of data. So that's why it's not recommended that you do this every time you create a macro, because it does modify your flow. So now we can go ahead and save this macro, come back to our workflow, replace it, and again we have in here 2 different tables that we'll be reading. We run this, we don't get any errors, and we see that we have 2 different IDs. One has, well, we have one WID, which has values for both breed and puppy. We have values in the breed name, for the breed table, and we have values in the puppy name for the puppy table that we're reading. So this way we have blended these 2 sets of data together without any major work. So that is where, if you're processing multiple files and your control parameter is indicating all those files that you'll be executing, make sure you understand what the data looks like that you're asking the macro to process. Hopefully these set of examples make you feel more comfortable with how to send data into your macro in order to get the work done. Basically, control parameters change values that are associated with the widgets that are inside of the macro, and your input data is the data stream that will be acted upon by your macro. So please subscribe to this video and to my channel. Send me any comments if I didn't clear everything up, or if I created more questions that you have. Hopefully when you get done watching this tutorial, you will be able to better create your macros and make your Alteryx development easier and more powerful. Have a great day.